Fantastic. Thank you for the lovely introduction. Thank you for inviting me to this wonderful space. My name is Christine. My pronouns are she, her, and I have medium length brown hair, and I'm wearing glasses today. I have in my background a picture of the atrium of the Portrait Museum here in DC where I work. It's one of the spaces I like the most. So I wanted to start with my story. So after law school, and this was a very long time ago, I was very lucky to clerk for a federal district court judge in Wisconsin. His name was the Honorable Judge John Reynolds. I actually saw someone is from Wisconsin in the chat, so perhaps they know this person. He was a former governor, a mentor, and one of the most curious about people I've ever known. He would also always ask people about their stories, the why of what they did. And he encouraged me to go into public service to make a difference somehow. So I started as a young, mostly clueless lawyer at Legal Action of Wisconsin, a phenomenal legal aid organization in Milwaukee. And then I went on to work on issues of educational equity in DC, including bilingual education. In 2000, I decided to join the federal family. I was still really green, to be frank. And one of the first things I was assigned to was to review a draft of an executive order that President Clinton was scheduled to issue in the summer of that year. An order that required all federal agencies to do more to provide interpretation and translation and other language access to individuals and communities who were limited English proficient, or LEP, and to ensure that recipients of federal funds did the same. Well, wow, right? What a way to enter government. Within weeks, I was getting calls from the White House. And for those of you who don't live in DC, oftentimes the White House really means someone who works at one of the executive office buildings near the White House, but it still was very impressive to me. And they would ask things like, how many federal agencies are there? To which I thought, I just started in the federal government. Isn't there like an easy answer to that question? But like most questions asked to lawyers, it depends on how you define agency. I was asked things like, well, how would this apply to X type of activity in Y agency? And I got to meet people from every component of the Department of Justice, from the Bureau of Prisons and the Marshal Service to the former INS before there was a DHS, and bankruptcy officials. I met passionate leaders from across all of the federal agency civil rights offices. And in retrospect, it was super humbling, but also very energizing because I was part of a federal community that was pointing in one direction. That is the direction of making access for the public and the individuals that we were there to serve. So that passion grew the more I learned from other people's experiences, the more curious I got, and the more cases our team was part of as we assisted folks. So Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its implementing regulations require recipients of federal funds to take reasonable steps to provide meaningful access to those people who have limited English proficiency. But this is something that some of our systems of justice and some of our federal agencies, some of the healthcare agencies, emergency response, and other critical services and agencies often struggle with. Some of the first cases I encountered early on in my, as an attorney in the Civil Rights Division, included heartbreaking matters involving families. In one instance, I worked on a case involving a teen who had arrived in the United States and learned she was pregnant after an apparent rape during her journey. Her baby died at birth. She could not communicate with local law enforcement in the state that she had come to, and she was charged with murder of her baby and jailed. Now, the court later addressed the error and she was set free, but not before she had been jailed for months. Then in 2008, a woman named Cyrilla, and I use her real name because this case received a lot of media attention. She gave birth to a little girl in a Mississippi hospital, and Cyrilla was a member of the Chitino indigenous group of southern Mexico. She spoke Chitino and virtually no English and very little Spanish. The hospital's Spanish-English interpreter was unable to effectively communicate with Cyrilla. Her fitness to have custody of her daughter was then questioned, in part because she couldn't speak English or communicate with the hospital or the child welfare organization. Her newborn baby was immediately taken into foster care. And for several months, Cyrilla attempted to fight for her parental rights in youth court with no effective interpreter. By the fourth hearing, the youth court ordered that her parental rights be terminated. Incredibly, at that hearing, the judge commented, "I know it's kind of unfair sitting here when she doesn't understand what I'm saying." That's a direct quote. It was a year before this mother and her child were reunited due to the efforts of the Southern Poverty Law Center with some support from DOJ and HHS. And unfortunately, this is not an isolated incident. And yet these incidents drive a lot of the work that I do today. In our investigations, we have found prosecutors interpreting for defendants, people signing plea agreements and other things that they do not understand because they have not been translated, domestic violence victims proceeding without interpretation, etc. So that's why we're making sure that language barriers do not translate into barriers to justice. And we've worked across numerous states, from California to North Carolina to Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, South Dakota, Colorado, and so many others, to help advance translation of vital documents and interpretation in the courts. And now we in my section are working across federal agencies and with state and local law enforcement in environmental justice matters, in healthcare, and more to ensure language access in every setting that involves federal or federally funded programs. And just a note that one of the things we have learned in this process is the importance of plain language in English, in everything we do, in outreach, in agreements, because when we sign a settlement agreement, but it's written in a way that can have more than one meaning, it certainly can cause problems for implementation. And the more complicated we make the terms of the agreement, and the less we distill it for the community it's intended to serve, the less likely that the community will be able to help monitor its enforcement. So we work on ensuring that we have plain language explanations of the terms of the agreement at a minimum, and that helps us to seek equity and justice for all. So now we are focusing more on readability of the original English language versions, and we find this also has significant positive impacts on translation. Change the slide. So there's a tremendous current interest in ensuring language access, and frankly, in ensuring 508 compliance and plain language, so that people that we are trying to serve in the federal government and the state and local governments can understand and take action on the important programs and activities that we provide. That interest goes way back, as I mentioned, the executive order that I originally reviewed as one of many, many people in the Civil Rights Division, and thousands of people, I'm sure, across the federal government, was Executive Order 13166, and it was issued in 2000. And it was reaffirmed in the Bush administration and many times since then under multiple administrations. Most recently in November of 2021, And actually it was November of 2022 because it was just this last November. So that is my error on my slide. I apologize. The Attorney General, Merrick Garland, issued a memorandum to heads of all of the federal agencies and heads of all the civil rights offices across the federal agencies, asking them to strengthen the commitment to providing language access throughout the federal government and to help make sure that recipients of federal funds were also strengthening their attempts to make meaningful access for limited English proficient individuals they encounter. And when he sent this memo, the Attorney General said that all people in this country, regardless of the language they speak, deserve meaningful access to programs and activities that are conducted or supported by federal agencies. Now, I know I've sort of shared a lot of information there. And so what I wanted to do was make sure that you know that there's a source for a lot of the information that I'm talking about today, and that is www.lep.gov. So let me tell you about this site for just a minute. Back in 2001 and 2002, when we first started doing a lot of the work to implement Executive Order 13166, this website was an other duty as assigned. There are so many people, but I bet you if I asked many of you to sort of raise your virtual hand, many of you have been involved in other duties as assigned. And if it was like this one, it was a passion project by a handful of federal civil rights staff and a wonderful, willing IT professional. And we put together a site designed to be a sharing space for federal agencies and recipients of federal funds and the public on language access. It was a great startup, but over the years, it fell of its own weight. It fell into a trap of becoming very user unfriendly. And because it was really built for dozens of links and dozens of pieces of content, not hundreds and thousands of links and content, it had become a horrible user experience, even for those of us who had helped to build it. And so we knew how to get what we wanted out of it. And so two of my staff, working with an amazing IT team and design folks, went to work to completely overhaul this website. They created a language indicator that is now identified as a best practice. They tried to make things easier to find and easier to digest. And this too is a combination and intersection of our language access work and our civil rights work and our mission and user experience and plain language. Now, I will say that www.lep.gov remains a work in progress and remains another duty as assigned. And so we need to be vigilant about the user experience while balancing our case and regulatory and policy work, and we welcome your feedback. What you'll notice on lep.gov is that you'll see information both about the law and policies requiring language access, things that I just talked about, but also resources, tips, and tools to help agencies deliver language access, whether that be procurement best practices or how to assess a telephonic interpretation service, or examples of plans, or examples of the work we have done across the courts or the law enforcement agencies or healthcare or emergencies or others to improve language services, whether that be in the context of an investigation that results in a resolution agreement or in the context of a more collaborative and even more collaborative, I should say, standard setting and technical assistance. So you'll find all of those on lep.gov, and I encourage you to explore. But now I want to ask you something. Why are we talking about plain language and translations and interpretation? And I'm going to just turn to the chat. I know they're an awful, thank you for the comments about the website looking great. Please, if you have thoughts about what is the intersection of translation, interpretation, language access generally, and plain language. I would love to see. Using plain language makes translation easier, streamlines the translation process. Exactly. And it's easier to translate, making sure it's accessible to the folks in the destination language. That's right. So if we've created something in a particular register, like at a 5th grade level in English, for instance, we want to make sure that the translator knows that's what we're aiming for in the target language as well. And so it's really important to remind folks to try to keep the translation plain as much as the English is plain. It's easier to translate. It's actually cheaper to translate generally when things are in plain language too. Not always, but generally. And a friend, Julia Graves, says we can't translate what we can't understand. Well, that's right. If there's more than one meaning in English, then how are you supposed to know as a translator which meaning it is? It's an equity issue. Using plain language makes it so much easier. All of it falls under the topic of access. And, on and on and on. That's exactly right. It's, let's see, equity, delivering information for people to understand consistently. Catherine and Laura, do you also have ideas for why this intersection is so important to be talking about right now?
I was all set to be really clever and say so many interesting things, but I see that people are already filling all of those in the chat, in the webinar chat. I think that the basic part, as far as I'm concerned, is what you said, Christine, which is that it's cheaper and easier. And honestly, the reasons after that, I just stopped looking for more reasons. Cheaper and easier just is like selling points to me, that there doesn't have to be anything beyond that. And honestly, I find that so often plain language ends up being a business reason, because nobody wins by saying, oh, it's more beautiful and fancier language. I say people will buy your stuff, and that leaves them, with nothing to say. And, with your material, people get it and they can understand it in the language they speak. Laura?
Yes, both of you have said absolutely everything that is, the foundation, right, for why plain language makes translations easier. And I would just only, I think, reiterate, not even add something, but just reiterate that we cannot expect translators to be experts in every field. And so if you write for them so that they can understand what you wrote, they will be able to translate it with no incident. And what you will get is something that the public, hopefully, will also be able to understand immediately. There's Christine, if you have a moment, there's a question here that I don't think I can answer. So does LEP.gov publish language access resources for government that are created by NGOs?
We have sometimes linked, for instance, the American Bars. We worked with the American Bar Association and the National Center for State Courts, and a number of folks to help lift up the standards for interpreting in courts that were adopted by the ABA, and we link to those. So it's not a one-size-fits-all answer to that question. Definitely would consider it.
Great, thank you for that. There's a question here that I'm inclined to answer if you think this is the right moment. If not, I can wait.
Go right ahead from my perspective.
Okay, so somebody, just for everybody, in case you don't see the question, Somebody asked, how do we address many state agencies' websites being translated using Google Translation, and surely that, surely that the language is not in plain language at all, so automatic machine translation causes misunderstanding for, well, you know where this is going. So I will say that the use of technology, and I like to call it, I like to move the conversation from machine translation to technology-assisted translation. Technology-assisted translation is a very useful tool because it allows you to build glossaries, it allows you to build the memory, and all of this will translate in less cost, because if you have memory, there are many things that you've already translated before and you vet it. And so those will be good. But nothing is, technology cannot be used as the sole source. I recommend that somebody look at that translation and massage it for your voice, your tone. You know, that your agency communicates in a way that technology cannot really mimic, but you can mimic. But absolutely have a foundation with technology and just take a look at it. It'll make your job easier, and you know, it'll cut costs too.
No, that's really helpful. And I would just underscore your point, Laura, that in general, technology is a great thing, right? We use websites and social media to get our messages out, to advance the work of our government agencies. I know there are lots of federal government folks on the call or on the webinar, lots of state and local government folks and others who are mission driven. And so if you want to get your message out, one of the many ways that you can do that is through technology, the very many ways of technology. And we're having to learn to tweet, right, in the Civil Rights Division, and we're having to learn to use all sorts of things to get to communities where they are most likely to see the information. Electronic communications make everything faster. They allow us to do our work together when we are physically apart. In this case, like you can share translations easily, or documents easily. You can make sure that if the underlying English language version of the document is 508 compliant, meaning that it is compliant with the, it is accessible for people who have low or no vision, that or low vision rather, and no vision, I guess. And then the translator will have that already built in to their translation. In the translation context, developing, as Laura said, electronic glossaries of commonly used phrases and translated into multiple languages can really ensure consistency and accuracy across translations. We frequently, when we send out translation, press releases or other documents for translation, we frequently send out, go-bys is what we call them, or examples of how this has been translated, this type of thing has been translated in the past to ensure consistency. Those are really important ways of using technology. People ask me about machine translation, and I would just point folks to the federal guidance in this area, which is that it is seldom, if ever, sufficient to use machine translation alone for vital information without having that translation checked by a competent human translator. Now, of course, it's getting better, and I bet you there'll be a lot of conversation about this in the chat. But for commonly translated languages, it is getting better, and for the subject areas in particular, but it is not reliable on its own if the information you're trying to communicate is important. And if you want people to act on them in a particular way. So here's just an example of something that we ran through a machine translation. This is on the left of the screen, the original source text of language from our complaint form in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. And it says, I understand that the material and information will be used for authorized civil rights compliance and enforcement activities. Now, mind you, we could probably have written that a little differently, but regardless, if you look over on the right, translated from into Korean using an online translation tool, it says, sorry, and then saying it back into English. The translation says, I understand that these information and materials will be used in compliance and enforcement of citizenship. Now, the problem with that, of course, is it doesn't make sense and it's not what the original says. But the second problem is it could be chilling because, you know, in the Civil Rights Division, our laws, most of our laws apply regardless of citizenship status. So the prohibition against discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin is a prohibition that protects everyone in the United States, not all citizens in the United States. And the Civil Rights Division's job isn't to, quote, enforce citizenship, right? That is not our job. And so this is a translation that not only isn't helpful, it could be affirmatively harmful. And so we would want to make sure that any translation that we used a machine to help us with also gets a review by a competent translator, who can make sure that it's accurate and doesn't convey the wrong message. Another piece of the technology puzzle that intersects with language access and with plain language and with communicating is an intranet. So we in the Civil Rights Division have gone to great lengths to create a better intranet. So these are the websites that are only, you know, the sites that are available only within your own organization. And they provide information about how you can do your job better. Or, you know, I mean, ours has our time and attendance, you know, application and all those sorts of things as well, right? But one of the things that we're finding is that a really good intranet site can really advance your organization's use of plain language, use of language access strategies, and frankly, use of making sure that things are 508 compliant and other ways to make sure that we are effectively communicating. So our intranet site, for instance, it doesn't really tell people how to procure interpreters and translators because it tells people where to go in our procurement office, who's in charge of procuring translators. And then we have a telephonic interpretation line and other options for procurement that folks can use to ensure that when we are, for instance, speaking to a witness over the phone, we can get a telephonic interpreter to assist us if that is necessary. There are lots of policies on our intranet that are helpful in terms of getting people, like the policies and procedures they need to do in order to ensure compliance and communication. There are glossaries, we discussed that a little bit. And there's a plain language guide and a 508 compliant set of templates. And so in fact, this slideshow the slide deck, I pulled directly from our intranet site, a slide deck, and used some of the slide templates, I would say, that were on there. Of course, I filled in the content, but in doing so, I was able to very easily come up with branded, clear, and 508 compliant slides. At least I hope all of that is true. And if it's not, I want to hear, because this is the work we're on the journey to do. And so this also shows us, you know, where do we go for help? And so I would really encourage folks to try to come up with a centralized place in your organization where you can build these go-bys, if you will, these templates, these glossaries, these ways of communicating in plain language, these ways of ensuring our documents are 508 compliant. I would really encourage you to do that so that everybody isn't reinventing the wheel, or worse yet, not doing it at all. And so that would just be a real strong suggestion that I would have as a great use of technology. Now, just before Q&A, I want to end with one thing. I'm going to end sort of where I began, which is to start. I started talking about and reflecting the passion and commitment that I felt as a new member of the federal government 23 years ago. So joining you today, I just want to say I still feel that passion and commitment. And the fact that there are 573 people on this call, on this webinar, that I am doing this with colleagues from across the federal agencies and colleagues from across the state and local agencies and so many others. It continues to energize this work. It continues to show me that the passion that we all have to communicate effectively with the people we are intending to serve is strong. And I am so grateful to have been here with you all. And thank you. And I look forward to your questions.